What fictional duo were obviously gay, but the franchise never had them come out? The English translations of Sailor Moon, Sailor Neptune and Sailor Uranus were cousins in the English version. It was awkward. At the end of the Cloak Art arc, before the anime enters the second arc with the Sakura cards, Sakura loses a battle with you for the right to be the Cloak Art's master. As punishment for losing, all the people in Sakura's life lose their love, memories of the person they love the most. When Sakura walks around that new world, she notices Tomoyo, but Tomoyo shows no excitement or interest towards Sakura, implying that Sakura is the person Tomoyo loves the most. That's one of my favorite episodes because it's so tragic. The punishment is not physical destruction but emotional, mental. Tomoyo is my favorite character from Cardcaptor Sakura. The show went super meta. At one point, they run into a guy named Chuck, later turned out to be God, who has been dreaming about their adventures and writing books about them. These in turn spawn a cult following, including fan fiction, and yes, even slash fiction between the brothers. They also had an episode where Sam and Dean are magically transported into an alternate reality in which they are the actors Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles. Thank you. I've read and edited a lot of fanfic over decades, and the thing that fanfic writers will never admit, despite being told there's nothing wrong with exploring beyond canon, is that it can be a very self-interested thing that is often fueled by their own wish fulfillment. Nothing wrong with it since we all have our preferences, but a lot of younger writers and hardcore older ones will totally flout any character authenticity for their fantasy. Again, nothing wrong with that, but you can't use it as your own personal evidence of why Draco and Harry were secretly railing each other while Dumbledore watched in jealous manipulative anger. You basically just invent your own propaganda at this point, where fandoms just dive into making their own mythology, and even harass the creators for not giving what they want. I support fanfic as a fan of any genre and writer development, but this pattern always has me hesitant to say I read it. It's porn, dude. You're really confused as to why porn is popular, when it's something like A/B/show that is just straight up porn. It's not about the characters' canon personalities. People are just writing about characters they find physically hot and putting them in porn. That doesn't mean they don't like the characters in canon. I mean, that would be like saying a guy can't possibly care about the character a female actress plays if he also wants to jack off to pictures of her tits. Well, not every A/B/show is porn though. There are some out there that have an actual storylines. Surprising, I know, and don't go into porn territory straight away. Still, there's still that distinctive reduction of personality traits and character quirks that I don't like. But that's not just A/B/show, but God, my life would be so much easier if it was, but other tropes as well. Some mo's, for example. A/B/show just is the most prominent in my opinion. I know to stay away from smut. I figured that it's not for me. But I can tell you it's not just the porn that does that sort of stuff. Nice metaphor. And sure, you can like and jack off to the same person, but fictional characters aren't like that to me. To me, they're nothing but characters. And if someone writes a story about them but takes away everything that makes them them, it does kinda feel like they don't appreciate, like the character. It's hard to explain, but that's just the way it feels to me. Some people in fan fiction have a hard time telling them leaves that their fantasy will never come true, and was never true in canon. I don't know why they care that much about that. I've read and written fan fiction for 20 years. Now, canon is optional. That's the main point of fan fiction. But I absolutely hate when people can't separate canon from fiction, or try to interpret canon in some very far-fetched ways just to fit their fantasy. Leave canon alone. Derive from it all you want. Do it, please. I beg you. Because at times canon sucks, but don't try to convince everyone that your fantasy is canon. That's something that confuses me about the newer generation of fandom. When I was a teenager, canon didn't matter. It was there. A lot of the time it was relatively liked by the fans, but it had no bearing on fandom activities. The few fandoms I've been in as an adult have been toxic. If you're shipping something not canon, be prepared for endless hate messages mocking you for your ship not being canon, or accusing fans of disrespecting the writer's vision by writing fanfiction for a non-canon ship. There's this weird idea that if your ship isn't canon, you've somehow lost a competition you weren't even aware you were in. Back in my day, it was just about having fun. Canon was simply the source material for fandom activities, and the two never intersected, and people knew they never should. Do they, though? I can think of more examples of cancelled in spite of a hardcore fan base than would have been cancelled except for the hardcore fans. The strongest example I can think of is that all the Star Treks owe their existence to hardcore Trekkies from the 70s and 80s, but the individual success or failure of any of them in particular seems pretty disconnected from fan opinions. Star Wars clearly never had a single fuck to give about what the fandom thought, and that franchise has not yet brought in its last $1 billion, and that's just fandoms in general. Fanfic. There is a large chunk of humanity that don't even know such a thing exists. Sorry, but I've been reading fanfic since the only way you could get it was from fanzines at conventions. Media West Con finally ended its long run a few years ago. It was the con to get fanzines for the longest time. One of the biggest reasons Star Trek survived was the fans in fanfic, and I don't mean the K.S. fanfiction. Zines were around for fan science fiction writing since the 40s. TV show fans picked that and ran with it in the 70s. Some was great, some good, some was bad, and some was very bad at times, but it allowed people to explore writing, and most of those were women who tended not to be welcomed as science fiction writers. Several who were able to polish their craft and become professional writers. Fan fiction led to actual professionally published fan stories for Star Trek in the anthologies New Voyages. This led into Star Trek books, and this led to other series getting professional published books. It may be wish fulfillment, but at least they are putting words down, and many learn how to write better in an environment that has tended to be more supportive of new writers. Well, at least tell people who think there is only one way to be a fan shows up. By the end of the series, it was fairly explicit if never stated. In one episode, Gabby's mom says something about finding a husband, and Gabrielle responds, "I don't need a husband, I have Xena." And then there's the really passionate mouth kissing when Xena is possessing Joxer's Autolycus's body, and when Xena leaves, Gabrielle tells him to take his hand off her ass, which to me clearly indicates Xena put the hand there. They kissed more than once. Xena kisses Gabrielle right after she marries Perdicus in Season 2. Season 2, Episode The Quest. It's not a vision either. Xena possesses Autolycus's body to help her get her body back so she can come back from the dead. She talks to Gabrielle through Autolycus and then tells her to close her eyes. "Close your eyes and think of me." Gabrielle then opens her eyes and sees Xena. They are in a dream world or similar. Xena talks for a bit and then absolutely kisses her right on the mouth. Gabrielle opens her eyes, comes out of the dream world, and it's Autolycus. Still, they were full on making out. It wasn't a 1-second smoochy. Alex Hirsch tried multiple times to include LGBTQ characters in Gravity Falls, The Cops, Wendy, and also more minor background characters. In one of the episodes, he wanted two old ladies that had been struck by the love god to jump into each other's arms and kiss, but Disney got back to him and said number. Alex Hirsch, knowing that they were being homophobic but that they also would never come out and say it, demanded that they give him their reasoning in writing, which also never happened. Ultimately, the scene never made the cut, but huge kudos to him for trying. Gravity Falls is a kids show, yes, but it, and a lot of other kids shows, especially nowadays, was written with enough nuance to get people of all ages invested. Kids could see the monsters of the week, and older or more attentive viewers could follow the story, lore and put all the pieces together over time. That's probably why people try to get older viewers to watch it. It's totally okay to not like a show, but I'm incredibly sorry that you automatically close yourself off to a wide variety of beloved stories simply because it doesn't have blood, swearing, or sex. Also, you'd be surprised at how much corporate meddling goes on behind the scenes with pretty much every single show on network television. Okay, I want to clear this all up because I often see this discussion on Reddit. Patroclus was raised by Achilles' parents, sort of like a foster brother. They were close childhood friends, they were companions in war, but Patroclus was subservient to Achilles, like a squire. They might have had sex, but it's not mentioned in the Iliad. If they had sex, it certainly wasn't an exclusive relationship, because both Achilles and Patroclus had a female sex slave and routinely raped Trojan women. They might have been romantically involved, but it's not mentioned in the Iliad. If they were romantically involved, it certainly wasn't an exclusive relationship, because Achilles refers to his sex slave as his bride. When Patroclus dies, Achilles is so utterly heartbroken that he goes on a murderous grief-fueled rampage, which is where the idea comes from that they were romantically involved. But that's up to everyone's own interpretation. Classical Greeks indeed usually interpreted them as romantically involved, but please keep in mind Homer lived several centuries before the classical Greeks. Personally, I always interpreted their relationship as sexual, but I think the English language doesn't have a suitable word for stepbrother, childhood friend, colleague, servant, polyamorous, sexual and romantic partner, but again, it's never explicitly said in the Iliad, no matter the translation, so it's up to interpretation. Yes, absolutely. A major point of the Iliad is that King Agamemnon takes away Briseis from Achilles. Briseis was a princess of a city allied to Troy. When Achilles conquers the city, he takes her as a slave and concubine. His soldiers get the other women they capture. The point is that she is property, and Achilles is mad that Agamemnon takes away his stuff. He supposedly loves her, but he killed her family before her eyes, so I'm quite sure the love isn't returned. Another slave of Achilles is named Diomed, who he abducted from Lesbos, and also sleeps with. Patroclus himself is once mentioned as sleeping next to another slave girl given to him by Achilles, who he abducted when raiding yet another city. There is never any explicit sex in the Iliad, but if a character wakes up nude next to their slave, I think the implication is pretty strong. It's also yet another reason why, whatever relationship they had, Achilles and Patroclus didn't have a conventional modern homosexual relationship. Here you go, honey, I abducted a sex slave just for you. Oh, that's so sweet of you. I don't think any Greeks had a conventional modern homosexual relationship. Their views on sexuality weren't really based on gender but the person's role in the sex. There wasn't gay and straight, it was fucker and fucky. If you were a Greek man, it was just as acceptable to plumb a man's guts as it was a woman's. Their version of gay only applied to you if you were the subservient one taking the pipe. Modern humans probably also would have considered the Greeks to be some pretty serious pedophiles. Most of their gay relationships were between teen boys and grown men. Also, most Greek men married in their 30s, but most Greek women married in their teens. All correct, but it's important to add, sexuality was seen very differently in ancient Greece. They didn't really have ideas of homosexual or heterosexual, and your sexual practices didn't establish an identity like citizen, slave, Roman, woman, etc. the way that sexual identity is today considered on par with racial identity or gender. Sexual practices were often seen as just that, sexual acts that didn't have some huge significance to who you are. Sex between men was common, even among men that would be considered straight if they were alive today. And sex between men was often seen as just the playful things that friends did, and was even common between male mentors and mentees. Achilles, so probably they did have sex, but that doesn't mean they were lovers the way we think about that idea now, and that sex didn't make them gay or bisexual, but they equally were not straight. Personally, I think the English language doesn't have a suitable word for stepbrother, childhood friend, colleague, servant, polyamorous, sexual and romantic partner. Most queer readings of historical texts are going to run into this problem, as the idea of orientation as a definable or diagnosable state of being is pretty new. History is rife with the patchwork of sexual moralities, but the idea that you're hardwired by biology towards girls or boys is a recent idea, to say nothing of the ever-changing expressions of intimacy and friendship that today we often lump together as queer. Did you know Frodo and Sam are gay because they hug a lot and say nice things to each other? Admittedly, Achilles' relationship with Briseis is also romanticized, or glossed over, a lot throughout history. Medieval Christian writers often called her his wife. Song of Achilles, very popular, gives Achilles an exclusive homosexual relationship with Patroclus. They solve the sex slave issue by having Achilles rescue Briseis from the other Greeks, and he never sleeps with her. Hollywood movie Troy does have Achilles sleep with her, but it seems kind of consensual. It's certainly not portrayed as the institutionalized rape it must have been. I mean, for my money, the closest that the Iliad implies that Achilles and Patroclus are lovers, perhaps even something like husband and wife, is when Phoenix tells the story of Meleager to Patroclus. This isn't a new theory obviously, but when Achilles starts sulking in his tent and refusing to fight even though his people are losing against the Trojans, Phoenix tells about how the ancient hero Meleager refuses to fight the enemy of his people due to some beef or another with his mom, until he is finally convinced to do his duty by his wife's name Cleopatra, the mirror image of the name Patroclus. Why else would Phoenix tell Patroclus the story of a wife convincing her husband to do his duty, a woman who shares his name, in order to try to get him to convince Achilles to fight? I don't know, I'm not a classical scholar by any stretch, but when a college professor explained that story I was fairly convinced. As I understand it, there are several words which sort of fall into the friend-love family and describe very specific situations which fall on a platonic spectrum from strictly brothers to everyone knows, and this isn't necessarily the same family of words for romantic relationships. Similar to how the Inuit have over 20 words for snow, Greek has been around and in use for so long that it has been highly refined, and often translators are stuck between forcing a translation which loses the nuance of the original or writing out the whole nuanced idea every time that word gets used. So, I just finished reading an excellent book called The Song of Achilles. It's a fictional book about how Achilles and Patroclus met. Such a good read. I cried. At the end of the book there are a bunch of Ask the Authors and FAQs, and one of them goes over this hilarious scholar text she came across from the early 1900s where the historian writing about the relationships between Achilles and Patroclus just doesn't make sense. The historian is completely dumbfounded on why Patroclus dying would affect Achilles so much after so many of his friends have died during the war over the 10 years they were besieging Troy. I never got the feeling that Hannibal was banned in the series, more so that he was asexual who used sex as a weapon against both men and women. To me, Hannibal's love never felt like something from sexual desire, but from something dark and twisted, like he was, from his desire to control, dominate, and lord over people. I view his love in contrast to his hate. He murders and eats those he deems frauds and unworthy, as the ultimate belittling. On this flip side, there is no greater gift Hannibal could give than his desire to own someone. Do as Ahithophel and Crowley from Good Omens count? They're not technically men, and according to the book, neither have an actual gender, but for the sake of the story, they are both male-shaped and male-presenting, and one of the actors, Michael Sheen, our hero, is nearly tripping over his wonderful self in order to make sure we know as Ahithophel and Crowley are in love, but canonically, They're still just friends. The story wasn't really a romance, but there were definite undertones, and overtones, of them being in love, which is fairly obvious to pretty much everyone in the fandom and their mother, but since at the end of the first season, they're still technically friends, one might argue, uselessly, that their bond is strictly platonic. They're honestly basically married though. They haven't been confirmed yet, and I won't spoil the show, but if you've seen any of it at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about.